What's going on YouTube? My name is ginj-tcg or Chris, and today I'm back for the first episode in the Master the Meta series, a series where I'm going to be covering a bunch of different decks. Each week I will cover one meta deck at a time, or one deck that's doing well, on the rise, I think has a lot of value to it, or just would be interesting to talk about, and I'm going to do a very deep dive into it. So instead of just spending some time in a deck intro and playing 3 matches, I'm going to spend some time talking about the deck in a little bit more depth, some of the options in terms of the tech cards and some of the other cards that are working well, especially into certain matchups, and then I'm going to go deeper into the matchups. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the statistics, getting data from sites like Limitless and Trainer Hill, as well as the Limitless Labs page, on the recent big tournaments and stuff, such as Worlds that has just happened, and kind of dive into how that affects this deck. So, what do the different matchups look like, kind of put those in a graphic chart to give it kind of a bit of a better visual, a bit more digestible, and just help people master a deck each week. And then I'll be closing it out with something that I will be calling a master ranking from here on out, where I took a bunch of different, it was actually 7 different categories on the deck to give it an overall number out of 10 and just talk about, is this deck worth playing? Is this deck worth buying? Is it worth investing? What level do we think this deck should be played at? And stuff like that. So, without further ado, I definitely want to jump into today's video. But before I hop in, I just want to remind everyone that this is the first episode in the series, and I am not necessarily a pro at editing. So although this video is going to have a ton, I am definitely still working out the kinks and trying to get a bit better at it. So if you have ideas on stuff you want to see, or stuff that you could think, would be more important to add into this video or stuff like that in the future, definitely let me know. Even if it's just, hey, I want to see this deck next week. I'm going to be making this a once a week series, and I think it could be a ton of fun and help people just take decks to a much higher level, and could be more fun than just watching 3 matches being played. So now, without talking anymore, let's hop into Joltik Box. Taking a look at the deck list this video has to offer, I took what seems to me to be the most stock deck list I could. So if you notice with Joltik Box, there's a lot of 2-in-1 of Pokemon that are involved, and it all revolves around Joltik, this 30 HP baby with the Jolting Charge attack. You take 2 Grass and 2 Electric Energy from your deck and attach them to your bench Pokemon in any way you like. So oftentimes that means loading up on an Iron Hands, or a Pikachu, or even a Miraidon, or maybe setting in energy up on Lillie's Clefairy so you can get the Psychic Energy down later and blow up things like a Dragapult. Now, I know many people are thinking, well, how do you consistently get this deck set up every time? And that's where this deck relies on Miraidon, potentially even more than Joltik, especially on that first turn. A deck like this definitely wants to go second. You want to go Jolting Charge immediately, because you need this attack on using Jolting Charge to set up your attacks like Ampy Very Much and Topaz Bolt, and take KOs later down the line. So assuming you're going second with a decent hand, you'd probably have something that looks like this as your 7 cards. You'd get a Miraidon in the active spot in this type of situation, and you'd use Tandem Unit to then get you a Joltik, as well as an Iron Hands, or maybe a Pikachu, depending on the matchup you're staring at. If it's something like Raging Bolt, you might lean towards the Pikachu because they're going to swing hard very quickly, and they have more than 120 HP. If the Pokemon you're staring at, or a deck that you're, playing against, is something that has a lot of Pokemon with less than 120 HP, you're probably going to go in with something like Iron Hands and use Ampy Very Much. But anyways, from here, you would play a Nest Ball or an Ultra Ball or something like that to get you the Latias, go in with your free retreat, manual attach your energy to Joltik, and then use your Jolting Charge to set up energy on the Iron Hands, the Pikachu, the Miraidon, whatever you can afford to get in play. Now, different matchups require different Pokemon that need to be used as attackers, and that's why this deck plays so many different options, which we'll get into in a second. For now, I just kind of want to keep talking about how this deck flows. The thing following this turn is like, oh, well, how do you keep energy in play? What happens if you take a KO and stuff like that? Well, that's where you start spamming cards like Crispin, and you rely on different tech cards such as Power Glass or EXP Share. The list I'm currently looking at is using the EXP Share, which I think is a bit more common, but something like Power Glass can help if you rely on Pikachu a lot, because you keep recycling energy and making it easy for you to loop Crispin plays. Now, once your energy is in play on just 1 or 2 Pokemon, it's very easy to 2-4-6 your opponent, because this deck has an amazing amount of Gust within it. So a lot of people are like, oh, you could Iono your opponent to a low hand size, and if they have boss, they got game. Well, when you're playing Joltik Box, it really doesn't matter the hand size, because the goal is to make sure you have a gusting card at all moments in time, so you can always take 2 prize cards and close games out very quickly before your opponent has a chance to truly set up. If you're up against, like a basic EX box deck or something like that, something that could blow up your Iron Hands very hard, I'm thinking Raging Bull, Ho-Oh box, decks like that, you try to rely on the Pikachu more with Resolute Heart so that you could tank the hit, but also take 2 prize cards. And if you're up against something like Gardevoir, early game Dragapult, or, some other evolving deck like Grimmsnarl, you're going to want to go in with the Ampy very much and swing for 120 damage with that attack to take 2 prize cards before your opponent truly gets rolling. Once they get that Gardevoir EX in play, the Grimmsnarl or the Dragapult, you'll rely on different attackers such as Pikachu EX, or in the case of Dragapult, you'll rely on Lillie's Clefairy. Both of these attackers in combination with Gravity Mountain or Vitality Band can take big KOs on the big stage 2 in play, allowing you to keep the 2 prize card race going even further after using Iron Hands. Now, at any moment in this game, your opponent is going to try their best to promote Pokemon that, won't give you 2 prize cards or something like that, especially if you're attacking quickly and buying time. And that's why we play 4 copies of Boss's Orders on top of Prime Catcher, which brings me to another tech card in this deck that I think is very useful to utilize, and again, not in this list, but something that a lot of people find importance playing, Iron Bundle. By having Pokemon Gust, Item Gust, and Supporter Gust, you can use Arven to get you Prime Catcher, you can use Nest Ball or Ultra Ball to get you Iron Bundle, or you could use Pokégear to get you Boss's Orders. So now you have a ton of different outs to feed into the Gust cards you naturally have in your deck. And if we take a look past Prime Catcher, we're seeing a bunch of tools in this list, which is another thing that Joltik box utilize. We're playing a high count of Arven. We're playing 4 Arven with 3 Pokégear, and Arven is generally our turn 1 supporter. Because we're playing so many tools and have options into other tools like Power Glass, Future Booster Energy Capsule, and different techs like that, we also could utilize the single prize Genesect. Again, not a Pokemon in this list, but I think if you're looking in the Joltik box, it's a Pokemon worth considering, because if you don't need to go Air Balloon or Bravery Charm turn 1, you could go Nest Ball for Genesect and take the Charm or Balloon on it just to shut down your opponent's A-Spec. So not only are you trying to run them over with Iron Hands or Pikachu, many A-Specs focus on consistency aspects of the deck, such as Secret Box, and now you're limiting that as well. So Joltik box actually has a lot of different options. Talking about different attackers within the deck, we do see here the Iron Hands and the Pikachu, and I've mentioned time and time again in the past 5 minutes that these are absolutely critical attackers to take down many of the decks. When we look at matchups like Charizard is where things could get a little difficult, and Charizard is doing a bit better right now. It seems to be a little bit on the rise, and that's where I want to talk about this deck's adaptability. This deck could easily play Iron Leaves, a second copy of Galvantula, both of which are very easy Pokemon to set up, and Oko, Charizard, or Grimmsnarl for weakness because they're grass attackers and we're already playing 5 grass energy in the deck. What we're currently seeing is a build built around taking down Dragapult in any capacity. We've got 3 psychic attackers, all backed by Lillie's Clefairy, which is one of them. So now our opponent's active Dragapults and even Raging Bolts have a psychic type weakness. So it's not very hard to use Joltik, to use Jolting Charge to set up the Lillie's Clefairy, the Mew, and if absolutely necessary, get 2 energy down on the Latias, and then try to stack up both our psychic energies on it as well to swing with Eon Blade for 400 damage. Latias is definitely the worst psychic attacking Pokemon in this deck, but when push comes to shove, it's not a bad backup attacker if you have your Mew in the prize cards, and you could still get Lillie's Clefairy down, you just don't want to utilize it yet. Now, that is, I feel like, a lot of the cards that help you in the different strategy, and I will be talking a little bit more in depth on how this deck wants to prize map against the top 5 decks in the format. But what I do want to spend a little more time focusing on is the versatility in this deck in terms of different options to play. What we're currently staring at is only a 1-card recovery deck. We've got 1 Super Rod in the entire deck that focuses on the recovery and EXP share if you count that, since you're still conserving energy. This deck could greatly benefit from playing Night Stretcher as well, because there is so much power in even just taking 1 energy out of the discard pile to manual attach, since this deck functions widely off manual attachments after the Jolting Charge. Also, using Night Stretcher for Lillie's Clefairy in a Dragapult dominated format is not a bad out. You do play 2 copies of Iron Hand, so if you're up against Gardevoir, that might not be the Pokemon you're taking, but it has a much higher energy cost than Lillie's Clefairy, so taking a extra electric energy or maybe a grass energy out of the deck out of the discard pile, could be very important as well. So Honestly, I don't think there's more recovery that's needed. I think maybe a 1-1 split between Stretcher or Rod could be important. I think if you just play bare minimum, I think Rod is the better out because you could recover a little bit more. But if you're looking to put a little bit more recovery in the deck, this deck does function very, very well with both a Night Stretcher and Super Rod. When we're talking about different Pokemon techs, I did mention the Iron Leaves already, and I think that speaks to this deck's ability to play many different attackers depending on how the meta shifts. If we see more Grimmsnarl Charizard dominated meta, I wouldn't be shocked if we started cutting Lillie's Clefairy or something like that for Iron Leaves. But right now with Dragapult, Dusknoir, and Dragapult Charizard dominating a larger portion of the meta share, we're going to lean into the Lillie's Clefairy with 2 basic Psychic Energy a little bit more. Playing Iron Bundle, as I mentioned, I think is a great out to make sure you have as many gusting options as possible, and using the single prize Genesect could be useful in different situations where many opponents are saving certain A-specs for later in the game where you have time to get the Genesect down with a random tool. So now to get into a little bit more of the matchups and how we're feeling, I have broken the matchups down into 5 different categories: auto wins, good matches, 50-50 matches, rough matches, and auto losses. They're broken down with auto wins being over 65% win rate on a combination of Limitless and recent trainer held data. Good matches being over 55 to 65% win rate, again on those same websites. 50-50 matches being anywhere from 45 to 55%, because a matchup is still, I think, considered 50-50, even if you're in that 45 to 50%. You know, a lot more luck could be involved and swing that 45 to 55 or vice versa. Rough matches being from 40 to 45% win rate, and auto losses being to 40% win rates and under. When we're talking about Joltik Box, we're talking about a deck that has such an insane level of consistency at getting Jolting Charge turn 2 and getting themselves set up very, very quickly and running you over before you can react. This naturally leads to a few solid auto wins, but more importantly, a lot of 50-50 matchups. And the reason being is because if you force Joltik Box to go first, you automatically have a better time getting your board a little bit more developed before they can truly run you over. So it's not necessarily a hard counter to the deck, but if you are playing in a best of 1 tournament or Joltik, you know, just gets some crazy good luck and is able to win that first coin flip and choose to go second, they most definitely can run you over before you can even blink. So, talking about some of the auto wins. These might not necessarily be the most popular decks, but they are still well positioned in the top 20 most played deck over on Limitless. We're looking at Frostlass Munkidori, and Zoroark, and Guardy Jellicent. All 3 of these decks can get absolutely abused in the early game by Iron Hands. In fact, Iron Hands is all you need to completely solo Frostlass Munkidori, because you're not taking any damage on the Iron Hands from the Frostlass Freezing Shroud's ability. You've got non-ability Pokemon in play, you go MP very much for the entire game and 2-4-6 your opponent, which is forcing a slow game that you don't care about because you don't even need to use your items much once you go Jolting Charge and then a bunch of boss's orders. And Zoroark and Guardy Jellicent are both decks where you can use Iron Hands in the early game and then still fall back on the Pikachu EX to blow up cards like Zoroark, as well as Gardevoir and Jellicent with either Vitality Band, or in the case of Gardevoir, you can use Gravity Mountain as well. When we're talking about the good matchups this deck has, we're going to get into a bit more of some more popular decks. We've got Charizard Pidgeot, Grimmsnarl, and Charizard Dusknoir. Charizard Pidgeot is coming in at the highest win rate out of this group with 58%, but Grimmsnarl and Zard Dusknoir are not far behind at 57 and 55% respectively. Both of these decks, all 3 of these decks, there are 3, there are not 2, good job Chris, get absolutely hammered by Iron Leaves and Galvantula. So while it's not included in every list, it is very easy to tech for, and even if you don't tech for it, it's not hard to still hit the numbers using Pikachu EX with maybe an extra copy or 2 of Gravity Mountain to make sure you're getting over the 300 damage marker very easily. In the case of Charizard Dusknoir, your opponent is relying on Dusknoir to work around your Pikachu EX, which means that they're going to give you a prize card in the process. So although they are able to one-shot the Pikachu, they are going to make it a little bit easier where if you have to KO their Chi-Yu or an early game Charmander or Duskull before they evolve, you're still going to math out your prizes very, very well. When we're talking about the 50-50 matchups in this deck, there are a ton that are outlined in front of you. We've got pretty much every version of Dragapult, including Dragapult Dusknoir, Dragapult Charizard, and Pure Pult. All three of these matchups are, I think, considered 50-50s because not everyone plays Lillie's Clefairy with 1 or 2 Psychic Energy. I think if you're a Joltik box player or looking into the deck a little bit more, you should expect a lot more Dragapult right now, and you should definitely include 2 Psychic Energy in this deck, because if 1 is prized and you only play 1, even if you have your Psychic Pokemon, it's going to be very, very hard to get them rolling since you're going to rely on the Lillie's Clefairy a good bit, and setting up the Mew EX is not always optimal since it does have under 200 HP, and Dragapult could hit that very easily with Phantom Dive and still spread the damage counters down across your bench. Other matchups where this deck is 50-50 into include Flareon, Miraidon, Goldengo, Guardy, Raging Bolt, Ethan's Ho-Oh, Ogerpon Box, and Typhlosion. When we're talking about Miraidon, Raging Bolt, and Ho-Oh box, it kind of comes down to, can they have a good turn 1? Those decks don't mind going turn 1 as much as Joltik box does, so if you can't set up your Pikachus quick enough going second, those could be a little rough, but for the most part, we've got much better opportunities to go boss's orders and then take out huge prize cards, whether it be using Iron Hands and swinging Ampy very much on the Knocked Owls, or using Pikachu EX to take the Raging Bolts, the Miraidons, and the Ethan's Ho-Oh. In a similar fashion, Goldengo is almost a perfect 50-50 matchup at 49% because we can also use Iron Hands in the early game to take out the Gimme Ghouls while using Pikachu EX to just blow the Pokemon up with absolutely no damage modifiers necessary. Gardevoir we've talked about a couple times. We have Iron Hands for the early game in Vitality or Gravity Mountain, Pikachu EX for the late game, but we have to remember that they have Monkey Dory at almost any point they need, so it's not going to be hard for them to work around Resolute Heart at all, whereas for a deck like Goldengo, that could be a bit more of a difficult feat, especially if you leave no damage counters on the board for them to play with. When we're talking about some of the other matchups, we look at Flareon, and we're looking at Ogerpon Box. Those matchups are very, very easy to run over with Pikachu. They don't have the Monkey Dories like we saw in Gardevoir that can work around. And when we're talking about Ethan's Typhlosion, that is a deck entirely consisting of single prizers. So while we think, okay, Typhlosion's a single prize deck swinging into a turbo 2-prize deck, Typhlosion should have the edge, it's actually a little bit harder because we have Iron Hands, so we can 2-4-6 our opponent in the same manner they can 2-4-6 us. However, in the case of Joltik Box, we don't have to rely on our Ethan's Adventure being in the prize cards, or not in the prize cards, to make this an easy match. In our case, we really just need to make sure we're going second, and we can definitely run over Typhlosion before they get set up quick enough to get multiple Typhlosions down. This deck, I think, is in a great position because there's really no rough matchups. It's just pretty solid into most things, especially the super popular decks. But when we're talking about auto losses, we are going to have a nightmare of a time into Crustle with 34%. The Mysterious Rock inability preventing damage from EX Pokemon is just too much for this deck to deal with. While you can use things like Mew EX, which can copy genome hack, which you can use genome hacking to copy their attack, which does have Shred, they can probably just heal out of it and kill you before you totally take them down with cards like Pokevital A, Monkey Dories, and Super Potions. The only other out we have besides the Mew EX would be our one copy of Galvantula, and Crustle is not nearly popular enough to be worth playing more than one copy. Even if you get Galvantula out, which can swing for 180 with the electric energy attached after the grass energy attack cost and swing for 180, all they have to do is play Luxurious Cape, and then you're still not one-shotting them, and they are going to be taking you out with one shot, unlike Mew EX. So that definitely is a matchup that you don't want to see, absolutely want to dodge, and really don't have the world's best chance against, and I would say is in the auto loss category. Of course, that deck has no draw engine, so is there a crazy world where they could maybe not go Ascension and just get a Monkey Dory down and kind of have a slow start? Yeah. But since you're relying on Jolting Charge, you actually are giving them pretty much two full turns at a minimum to get even a second Pokemon down, and most importantly, the Crustle to take down pretty much the entire deck. Now, talking about 5 of these decks and how to beat them, we are going to be talking about Grimmsnarl, Dragapult Dusknoir, Goldengo, Raging Bull, and the recent world champion Gardevoir EX, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the prize mapping and how to take down these 5 decks in specific. When we're talking about Grimmsnarl, this deck is on a little bit of a decline post-World since it didn't have a great World showing at all, and more people have found Gardevoir to be the better Devo deck. Grimmsnarl is a very beatable matchup, and you don't need the Iron Leaves for it. You can evolve your Joltik nice and early into Galvantula, take out a Morgrim, or more importantly, a Grimmsnarl, but in this matchup, they're going to have a bit more of a slow play style. So you're going to use Joltik in the early game for the Jolting Charge, and ideally, you get an Iron Hands, maybe even another down if your bench is absolutely perfect, because you want to 2-4-6 your opponent. You're going to use Ampu very much 2 times. Ideally, you want to focus down the Munkidorys. The reason I say that and not the Morgrims is because you want to make sure that your opponent does not have a great time to use Munkidory and get around the Resolute Heart ability, which is going to close out our 5th and 6th prize cards for the game with a Gust KO on Grimmsnarl EX. If you could keep your Pikachu at full HP, that means that Grimmsnarl really can't one-shot Pikachu. Grimmsnarl does swing for 180 damage, so to do that they would need something like Defiance Band, which the deck doesn't normally play, and in general they'll probably have a Frostlass or 2 down so they could still work around Resolute Heart. But regardless, taking out the Munkidorys makes it much harder for this deck to even take out a second Iron Hands. Now, using Iron Hands to take out 4 prize cards isn't the world's most impossible task, because remember, you're going to use Jolting Charge to get 3 energy on the Iron Hands, and then the 4th one down on either a second Iron Hands or a Pikachu EX. From there, you can use a combo of Crispin and EXP Share to make sure that by the time you've used your first Iron Hands and it gets KO'd, your second one will be already set up and ready to rumble. Iron Hands taking out Munkidory greatly slows this deck down and makes it much harder for your opponent's Grimmsnarl EX to even take out a Iron Hands with 1 shot, because we also have access to Bravery Charm. So if you can charm up the first Iron Hands, take a boss KO on a Munkidory with the second Iron Hands, and close out with the KO on Grimmsnarl with a Pikachu EX, this deck has a fine time without even touching a card like Iron Leaves or Galvantula. Obviously, including those makes this matchup just that much better though. When we're talking about Raging Bolt next, we've mentioned it before, this one's going to be a little bit more of a 50-50 and potentially even a little, like a tad more favorite into Raging Bolt, because they don't mind going first. Most Raging Bolt builds play the Owls in them, and in playing the Owls, that means that they could go Fan Rotom, get their Hoot set up, and take a Knockdown in the hand to have a good turn following that. However, the biggest thing with Raging Bolt, they cannot one-shot your Pikachu EXs. They rarely ever play a card like Munkidory or something else that could get some damage counters down before swinging with their active. So yes, going Iron Hands to take out, the Baby Bolt with Vitality Band or Future Booster Energy Capsule, or even easier, going for an Iron Bundle play and taking out the Hoo-Oo or a Boss's Orders on the Knockdown, for a first 2 prize cards isn't a bad shout, but this might be the matchup where relying on Pikachu for more prize cards is ideal. I think in general it's a little bit easier to just conserve the energy. On the Pikachu, it's an easier cost when you take into account how effective Crispin is. You can use Jolting Charge to set up 2 Pikachus almost in their entirety, as long as you still have a way to find the metal energies, and then you can 2-4-6 your opponent by going for KOs on Raging Bolts, Ogerpons, Fezandipitis, Squawkabillies, Latias EX, and Bloodmoon Ursaluna, which Raging Bolt could all play. So you've got plenty of ways to work around Raging Bolts, leading to the 50-50 matchup. It truly just depends who gets set up first and who's able to more consistently run the fade. When we're talking about Gholdengo, the deck that dominated Worlds in terms of play rate, we need to keep in mind that we cannot leave damage counters on the board for their 1, maybe 2 Munkidorys to use. Now, not all builds of Gholdengo play the Munkidory, but unless you are 100% certain that your opponent does not play the Munkidory, it's very easy to just work around it. What that entails is not attacking with Iron Hands if you're not swinging for KO. You can definitely go Ampu very much for KO on your opponent's Gimmighoul if they didn't already use Genesect EX to evolve all of the ones in play. I think an easier play rate similar to Raging Bolt would be to just go Pikachu EX. There's not much this deck could do even with the Rigid Bands who dodge Pikachu from the OHKO, and if you don't leave them with any damage counters in play, they have absolutely nothing to Monkey Dory off and take out your Pikachus. So if you use Pikachu's ability to maximum potential, ideally you could get 2 KOs with each Pikachu, and even if you just get 1 KO with a Pikachu, you can still 2-for-6 your opponent before they have time to take them all out as well. Again, Gholdengo is a deck that can hang going first because all they need to get is Genesect EX down, and once they do that, evolving becomes such an easy thing for this deck. So if they'd spend turn 1 just getting Gimmighouls down, and then turn 2 use Genesect's ability to take 2 Goldengos from their deck into their hand, evolve, and swing, it sets up almost just as fast if Joltik box, if not faster, since they have that turn 1 potential. So that is definitely a 50-50 matchup. Getting into one of the other most popular decks in the format is Dragapult Dusknoir at 54% win rate. We definitely feel a little stronger into that, and that's because we probably have the most options with the current version of Joltik box to take this deck down. If they're using Dusknoir, that takes a little bit of the pressure to go for an Ampy Very Much play on a Dreepy, but this is a slow deck that relies on Bidoof a lot in the early game, and we don't need many items to function, especially if we are able to go second. A Jolting Charge onto an Iron Hands can greatly reduce their deck's setup and speed capabilities if you can go Boss's Orders or Prime Catcher onto the Dracloaks and slow their draw engine down even farther. And more importantly, again, we've got Lillie's Clefairy and Mew EX, which are going to be amazing attackers, swinging for weakness on the Dragapults before they can truly get their board set up. By utilizing Bravery Charm effectively, you can make it also pretty difficult for your opponent to take a KO on a Pokemon like Fezandipiti if they just put 10 damage counters on the Fez with Phantom Dive. If you smack the Charm on that thing, now it's at 260, and now the math is thrown off, so it's not the most optimal boss KO anymore for them. Dragapult Dusknoir, definitely a little more favored than the previous 2 decks talked about, but I mean, I'd still say it's a 50-50 because Dragapult Dusknoir is that strong a deck, and if you cannot get your Bravery Charms down fast enough, or you prize something like Lillie's Clefairy or an Energy at an unfortunate time, it might be pretty hard to beef your way through Dragapult. Again, this is a deck that could also utilize Monkey Dory, so this is just another situation similar to Gholdengo where you want to make sure that you're not putting any damage down on the board unless you're taking 2 prize cards. That's a super important tip playing this deck when Monkey Dory is so popular. We have Resolute Heart, one of the most overpowered abilities in the game. We want to make sure our opponent cannot Adrenabrain onto the Pikachu and make that a waste of time. When we're talking about Gardevoir now, we get into a world where we want to just amp for game. The only option where that's really maybe not something you do is, again, when you're using Gravity Mountain or Vitality Band on the Pikachu to close out the match, since they can now swing over 300 damage and take out the Gardevoir EX. Gardevoir is a bit of a slower deck that gets damage more down on their own terms, so it's a bit harder to use Pikachu because they could easily work around Resolute Heart, and this is why I think using Iron Hands a little bit more in this match, and maybe even the Galvantula to try to offset their prizing, could be a very effective strategy to use. In general, I recommend trying to take down those Kirlia in the early game because a lot of times Gardevoir might only be able to get 1 or 2 in play. So if you go Ampy Very Much on a Gardevoir EX one turn, and then they only have 1 Gardevoir in play with no Ralts, there actually is a world where using Pikachu could be extremely effective because you know the following turn, they're not going to have an easy time at all getting energy into play to take another KO without getting another Gardevoir down and set up. This matchup is definitely probably the closest 50-50 out of those mentioned today. It's very difficult, but it is definitely doable. Gardevoir is a deck that also likes to go second for Arven, so it's going to be a bit more of a who goes second battle with this. One additional tip that I definitely wanted to cover when I'm talking about Joltik box to everyone is saving the Prime Catcher. Prime Catcher is such an amazing card in this deck, allowing you to not only have a switch pivot, but another gusting option. And the reason why I say save Prime Catcher for as long as possible is because this deck does not do well into Iono. We don't have any draw engine in the deck except Fezandipiti. So if your opponent Ionos you to 1 or 2 cards, it's going to be very hard to recover from that, especially especially when chances are you're just looking for boss's orders. So why are we saving Prime Catcher? How does that help us in this situation? Well, by saving Prime Catcher, you're actually able to have a better chance at drawing into boss's orders, because now drawing Arven also gives you a gusting option. Let's say your opponent Ionos you to 2 cards, right? Because you're trying to 2/4/6 them. Normally, if you just have 4 boss's orders in the deck, there are only 4 to 7 or 8 outs, depending on how many copies of Pokégear you play and have not used yet. If you leave the Prime Catcher in your deck, and you, let's say in this scenario, have 2 Arven left in your deck, that is 2 more cards that not only you could draw into, but 2 more cards that Pokégear could hit as well that get you to the spot you need to be to close out the game. So remember, if you don't have to Prime Catcher and you have boss's orders in hand, I recommend using the boss first, because saving that Prime Catcher for the late game is what makes Joltik box players always seem like they have gusting cards in their hand. Now, getting into the master ranking, the last part of this series, I want to talk about 7 overall stats for the deck. I want to talk about the price. Is this a deck worth investing? How cost effective is it? The consistency, how good are we able to get our strategy set up and done well and right against our opponents, no matter which one. The power, how effective are we at taking prize cards and swinging for good damage to close out games. Our speed, which is how quickly we are able to set up. Our versatility and adaptability, which would be our ability to change our deck depending on the format shifting or different decks becoming more or less popular. Our base skill level, or how easy is this deck to pick up and play, and a little bit into, you know, how likely are you able to master this deck within a reasonable amount of time. Our matchups, or, you know, how are we into the current meta and the current decks we're facing, and the overall ranking. How good is this deck in general terms, and how competitive are we talking about bringing it? Getting into the price. This deck is a little bit more on the pricier side, and I'm not going to lie, that's really just due to some singles, most notably Latias, Mew, Lillie's Clefairy, and Fezandipiti. Those cards are a little bit more expensive, most of them being over $5, and if I'm not mistaken, Latias and Lillie's Clefairy and Fez are all over 10, so this is a bit of a pricier deck. Now, the reason it's a 6 out of 10 and not something a little bit lower is because the cards that are expensive are not only important in this deck and not totally breaking the bank with anything over 30 bucks, but they're insanely important in so many other decks. So I actually think in terms of the investment, it's a 6 out of 10 because you do have to spend the money to get some of the most important singles in this deck, but those are singles you can play in a lot of other decks. So I actually don't think this deck is the worst one in terms of cost right now. Is it the most cost-effective deck? Absolutely not. But when we're talking about some dominating decks that also give you a lot of cards you can use in other decks, I think it's pretty reasonably priced and placed at a 6 out of 10. When we're talking about consistency, there is no deck that can pull off Jolting Charge so easily or get the energy down on turn 2. And I'm not just talking Jolting Charge, I'm talking getting the general strategy set up. This is one of, if not the most consistent meta deck we've seen in a while, I think. I think getting Jolting Charge down is so easy. And yes, I know you're going to say, oh, just make them go first. And now they can't set up as well, and you can get your board rolling a little bit more so they can't run you over. And you're totally right, and I think that's why it's at a 9 out of 10, because that's not really due to this deck having consistency problems. That's due to an innate scenario where your opponent could work around this deck's way of setting up. I think if you just let this deck attempt to set up without changing much for 50 times, they're going to be able to pull it off well over 45 times out of the 50. So I think this deck is definitely at a 9 out of 10 consistency. Now, the power on this deck definitely takes a little bit of a drop, being at 7 out of 10, and the reason being this deck swings for finite amount of damage. Although there's a lot of cards that could modify the damage and how hard you swing, it's not like Raging Bull or Golden Go where you can swing for infinite damage or Gardevoir if you can get your Drifloons and Screamtails tanky enough. This deck is a little more stagnant, but you have the ability with Iron Hands to KO low HP Pokemon and still take 2 prize cards without swinging for 80 quadrillion damage like some of the previously mentioned cards. The ability to do that is super overpowered board and definitely brings this deck up to a 7 out of 10 on power. The speed of this deck is an 8 out of 10. This deck will be swinging ideally for 2 prize cards on the second turn of play, which is crazy fast. The reason it is not higher is because if they go first, you can get a bit more of a board set up. But if you let Joltik Box just run completely free and you don't have the best board in play, they will run you over and finish 3 games in your 50-minute match before you've even hit the halfway point. The versatility or adaptability of this deck is a 9 out of 10. I think this is one of the most adaptive decks in the format, where you have so many different options depending on the top decks, such as Iron Leaves. You've got different gusting options with Iron Bundle. You've got the great attackers we've already mentioned, such as Miraidon, Iron Hands, Pikachu, Lillie's Clefairy, Mew EX, and Bloodmoon Ursaluna, so you just have options to swing into whatever you're staring at. And I think those options can change in count, but more importantly, on which ones are even in the deck, depending on, is there a lot of stage 2s in the meta, is there a lot of low HP basics in the meta, you know, what do we need to do to go boss for game in this deck? The base skill level in this deck needed for this deck is definitely a 10 out of 10. This is not a super hard deck to play, and if you're new to learning the game, it's not super hard to play at some small local tournaments and do pretty well. Whatever Pokemon you're staring at, even if you don't know if it evolves into some massive Pokemon, you can use Iron Hands to KO it before they evolve, and once they evolve, there's like a 95 or higher % chance you could KO with Pikachu EX. So just relying on those 2 attackers, you can still close out games very easily and very effectively without needing to worry about some insanely hard decisions on like what's an Ultra Ball away. Generally, if you keep your boss's orders and try to work out how to take 2 prize cards every turn, you're fine. I think the hardest thing in this deck comes on learning how to conserve the energy and use it effectively, but once you learn that you're going to 2-4-6 your opponent before they can blow you up and truly set up, I think you'll realize that it's not actually hard to just set up 1 to 2 Pokemon after the initial jolting charge. Leaving this deck at an overall 8 out of 10, I think this deck is super effective at most competitive levels and definitely one that you should consider playing to big tournaments like regionals. And if you're considering taking it to the biggest sets of tournaments, you definitely could play it at absolutely any level of play. Now that is going to wrap it up for today's Joltik Box Master the Meta class. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope the editing was decent enough and you were able to stay interested. And if there's anything you want to see in the future, stuff you think would be useful to talk about, please let me know. I definitely want to make this a fun series that people like, and let me know what decks you want to see on the next episode next week. I will definitely be reading the comments to see what decks are popular, and I'll probably put out another poll just to get that baseline on what people actually want to see. I want this to be helpful to you guys. It's a ton of fun to record and make them, so I'd love it if, you know, we can try to get the series out there and see how it does overall. With that being said, thank you guys so much for tuning this in to the first episode of Master the Meta. I hope you guys learned a ton about Joltik Box and do amazing with it at your next tournament. With that being said, stay epic. Peace.